Welcome to the Expert Edge. This is the show where we bring on experts in their fields of health and wellness, and we hear their stories and learn what they see working in the field of diabetes reversal and prevention. So I'm really happy to introduce today's guest, Erica Golden. So glad to have you here with us, Erica.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Erica is a registered dietitian nutritionist with a passion for mental health and gut health and how the two are connected. So she specializes in conditions that include depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, disordered eating. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about this whole connection between metabolism and our mood and our mental health. She's the author of the book Nutrition and Mental Health, and she provides continuing education resources to help other registered dietitians provide better care for their clients with depression and anxiety. Please tell us a little bit about how you got started with your interest in that intersection of lifestyle and health.
Yeah, so I think I've really always been interested in health. From
Mm.
as young as I can remember, I've always thought that food and nutrition were really interesting. I've always loved baking and cooking. And then in university, decided to study nutrition just kind of like I don't really know what I want to do in my undergrad, but I think this will be helpful to whatever I decide to do in the future. And I just ended up falling in love with it completely. I love working with people in such a practical way. I think nutrition is one of the foundational tools because everybody has to eat. And so we can make such varied choices about what we choose to eat that can make such a varied impact then on our health outcomes. And I love to teach people about that. And I love to teach them ways to make it really practical and
Mm.
actionable. Yeah, just not expensive, not pricey, not difficult, not complicated. It's just fun and enjoying being in the kitchen.
I love that approach because I think that when we enjoy doing the things that also support our health, that's a great winning combination. And it sounds like this whole interest in health and how our own choices affect health has been something that has been really interesting to you for a long time.
Mhm.
So, as you've studied, you've worked with clients, what is the connection that you've observed between diabetes and depression?
Yeah. So, not everybody with depression has diabetes, right? Like that's pretty obvious. And not everybody with diabetes has depression either, but there is a really strong connection. So even in the research, we see this all over the place. There is this very strong link between metabolic issues like depression and inflammation, which often is associated, not always, but often is associated with depression as well. And so there's a lot of linkages between those two conditions. Now, there's a lot of things that can cause depression with diabetes and with these chronic health conditions that really impact your life and the way that you are able to live. So yeah, some of it is just quality of life, right? Like the stress of managing this chronic condition can certainly be a factor in leading to depression as well. But it does seem to be more than that. It's not just that stress, it's also something on a deeper, more cellular level. These metabolic changes that happen have a fairly strong connection to changes that happen even in like neurotransmitter levels in the brain. So it's kind of interesting. And what I think is really cool about that is that people have this amazing way to impact both conditions at the same time. So it's not like we're teaching them, one way of living and eating and exercising and stuff to stave off diabetes and one way to treat depression. It's the same stuff, the same lifestyle changes for both.
Yeah, I love that too. How synergistic positive lifestyle choices are in terms of helping every part of our body work better.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
let's dive into a little more, maybe the physiology. Like, what is it that makes diabetes and depression often occur together? What are some of those mechanisms where the diabetes, the metabolism issues actually impact our mood?
Yeah, yeah. So one of those ways is is that kind of link between the neurotransmitter levels. So we know that when people have chronically high insulin levels over a long period of time, that directly impacts serotonin levels in the brain. So can in that way cause some symptoms of depression there. We
Mm.
also know that there's a strong link between changes in the gut microbiome and depressive symptoms and diabetes as well. Any kind of metabolic changes impact the gut microbiome. And that's something that we call bidirectional. So it goes both ways. So if we have a diet that changes the microbiome, then the microbiome also changes our metabolism. So it's kind of going both directions at the same time, and it can be a little bit of a vicious cycle. However, we can also change that and hopefully make it more of like a virtuous cycle, kind of change it and make
Right.
it a better fit, their diet a better fit for their metabolic needs. But
I
it is
think that's
a challenging process.
yes. And I really caught my ear how you talked about this interaction between insulin and serotonin. So you said as insulin levels go up, serotonin levels go down. And I think that's really interesting because for many people, one of the first signs that they're having metabolic issues, maybe not doing well with carbohydrates, is that their insulin levels go up. In fact, I
Mhm.
know I've seen many people's insulin levels rise before blood sugar levels go up. So,
Yeah,
like before prediabetes,
yeah.
often that high insulin is in play. And then you said that high insulin level decreases serotonin. So, can you tell us a little bit about serotonin and its effect on our mood?
Yeah, and just to be clear, just in case anybody is kind of interested in this, the initial rise in insulin, like if it's very short term, so for those who might not have any form of metabolic issues yet, and you eat a high carb meal, in response to that high carb meal, your insulin levels are naturally going to rise just kind of in the short term. That short term rise in insulin is actually associated with an increase in serotonin levels, but it's that chronically high insulin that
Hmm.
actually can decrease the serotonin. So
And
anyway,
that
just for
makes sense.
clarity.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
important. So, tell
Yeah.
us a little more about serotonin and why is that important for us to feel good?
Yeah. Yeah, so serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that we think is most closely associated with depression. There are others. We think dopamine and GABA, norepinephrine. There's a lot of things that go into
Hmm.
play with depressive symptoms, but serotonin is the one that most antidepressant medications are targeting. So if you have ever taken or know somebody who's taken an SSRI or an SNRI, those medications are targeting serotonin. The reason is because serotonin is so involved with our mood, with mood
Hmm.
stability and mood regulation, happiness, pleasure, even learning and memory. And then in the rest of the body, serotonin is actually really important in other aspects of our health too. So in different parts of the body, it's doing different things. It's even acting in the gut to like stimulate motility of things through our guts. That's why some medications that target serotonin will also cause GI side effects. So it's a very, very important neurotransmitter. And so if we are having any kind of impact on those serotonin levels or on our sensitivity to serotonin, we're going to feel those effects because it is just so important and so far reaching in the body and in the brain.
That's really fascinating because if I'm thinking about it, many people that are diabetic, so this is the other kind of end of this metabolic spectrum, they've already developed diabetes, maybe their pancreas isn't working well, so they're now injecting insulin.
Mhm.
So our normal body production of insulin, I think, is somewhere between maybe 15 and 20 units a day, just normal non-diabetic production. Yet when I think about many insulin dependent diabetics, they might be taking 40, 80, 120 units of insulin every day, which means those levels are very high. And
Mhm.
so that is really a strong factor, I believe,
Mhm.
in affecting their serotonin production, even though this insulin is the injectable, not what their pancreas is making. That high insulin level is still going to have a similar effect. And
Mhm.
and that seems like that would be also significant, which is one of the reasons that when I talk to people about diabetes, I'm talking about insulin sensitivity. So no matter what kind of um, interventions you're needing to control your blood sugars, the more insulin sensitive you are, the less insulin you need, whether your pancreas is making it or you're injecting it. And that's going to have a positive effect on all these
Mhm.
other symptoms. But let's dive
Totally.
into the whole microbiome piece a little. So
Mhm.
tell us more about what's happening in the microbiome and how does that really intersect with and support or not support experiencing a good mood.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love to tell people is just how active and vital the microbiome is. We're still learning. We have a lot
Mm-hmm.
more learning to do on it. There's so much that we don't know, but we're learning that it is involved in just about everything that happens in our body. And there is more DNA in your microbiome, your gut microbiome, than there is in all the cells of your body. So there's like more of not you inside of you than there is of you.
Which is
So
really
that's
kind of
why
mind-boggling.
it is. And that's why it's so like wildly important in everything that happens in our body. And we know it's very metabolically important too. So when you eat food, it's not just like you absorb these nutrients directly into your bloodstream. They are interacting with those microbes in your gut all the way through. And those microbes are actually acting on it, maybe in some cases to kind of help break it down, in other cases to kind of um, produce not so great compounds from it. So there's a little bit of a difference between like what bacteria are supposed to do with fiber, where they ferment it and break it down and make some really, really healthy compounds that decrease inflammation. We call them short chain fatty acids. They're really, really important to health. And then on the other hand, some of the foods that we consume that our gut bacteria acts on as well, but in a not so great way. Some people call it putrefaction, which sounds pretty bad and it kind of is. um, and so that's what it can do with certain types of like proteins. It's really dependent on both the quality of the diet and the plant components of the diet, and also with the pre-existing quality of the microbes in your gut. So if you have this really robust, healthy gut microbiome that has lots and lots of these good gut bugs, then you're going to be producing lots and lots of short chain fatty acids.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a whole lot of not so great ones, these kind of potential pathogens, the ones that are kind of nasty and don't really like you too much, they can produce a lot of very inflammatory compounds from your food. And those kinds of compounds actually are linked with changes in your brain as well. So, as we're producing these inflammatory compounds in the gut, it's changing kind of the barrier function of the gut. It's how permeable it is, how much or how little it lets through. And that can also change the permeability in your brain as well. That blood-brain barrier is not supposed to be permeable at all, but if the gut gets really dysfunctional, the blood-brain barrier can become a little dysfunctional as well, and then we can have more inflammation in the brain. So you can kind of see how this connection, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with the role of inflammation in diabetes. It's very involved with depressive symptoms and changes in inflammation in the brain as well. So, yeah, that connection is super strong, and the microbiome does actually play a pretty substantial role there.
That's really fascinating. And I think that helps explain why when people start to get their blood sugars under better control, they feel better. They're
Mhm.
happier, they have more energy. It really is a physiologically explainable connection between the gut and the brain. Now, you talked about kind of two categories, two large categories of microbes in our gut. You talked about one that really likes to break down, ferment fiber, and how positive that is for our mental health as well as all the other aspects of physical health. So, if we want to have a preponderance of that healthy bacteria, what are the kinds of foods that can really help us to grow that healthy, positive bacteria that makes all these wonderful short chain fatty acids for us, helps us with our immune system, helps us with our mood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, some of the things that we know are the most beneficial for the gut microbes, we call prebiotics. And this is a pretty specific, like elite group. It takes a lot to be proven to be a prebiotic. But basically, what they are at the most simple level is food for those gut bugs. So, in a lot of cases, right now, these are fibers, plant fibers. So we're looking at, bananas and artichokes, um, onions and garlic, inulin, which is an additive often, but it's actually, originally found in whole plant foods. So these kinds of like elite groups of prebiotics that we actually have good enough data to say these are the specific gut bacteria that they feed, and here's the specific positive benefits that they give on specific areas of our health. That's how we're able to label them as prebiotics.
Mm.
However, there's a whole lot of candidates out there that haven't officially been like labeled as prebiotics, but still, we actually do know that they're amazing for our health and amazing for the health of our microbiome. And one that I think is really cool to talk about is just phytochemicals in general. So those color compounds in our food found in everything that is, every color from white to orange to red to green, like I like to tell people, white is actually a color when it comes to plants. All of those compounds seem to nourish our gut microbes as well, which is really cool. So, this is one of the reasons why I try to get people eating as much different variety of plants as possible. We try to shoot for anywhere from 30 to 40 different plant foods in the course of a week. That can be
Wow.
hard at first, but you can get there. We have some really practical and actionable ways to get there. And there is a change that happens. It doesn't happen immediately, but over the span of even just a couple of weeks, we can actually start to see people's microbiomes change. And they've done like stool studies in labs, and they can actually see the changes that are happening in just 3 weeks or so in the microbiome, which I think is really, really cool. There's not too much that can change that dramatically in our health in just that span of time. So, pretty neat.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So these plant foods that are full of fiber help to feed the good gut bacteria that we need. So the more fibers, plant fibers foods we have, probably the better. And I love how you brought in the whole color aspect. We like to talk about telling people to eat the rainbow, and that rainbow comes from the produce department, right? That's where you see the all the different colors, the greens, the oranges, the reds. We want a variety of those. And that's why you talked about 30 to 40 different kinds in a week, because they provide different kinds of fiber, they provide
Mhm.
different kinds of phytochemicals. All of these are really important for optimizing our gut health. And I just think that is so important for people to take home today. It's like when you go to the store, fill your grocery cart with different colored foods and do that every week, so that what you're pulling out of your refrigerator is automatically reflecting that rainbow of colors that helps to feed your gut. Now, you also mentioned, I thought you might just take a couple of minutes on that, is that there's another set of bugs in your gut that tend to putrefy our food. They're specifically like work on proteins. Is there any kind of class or category of proteins that they like best, that we might want to think about decreasing in our diet?
Yeah, so it's more about the type of gut bugs and the quantity of them that causes that putrefaction to be
Mm,
more prevalent. So there's always going to be a small amount of this going on in everyone's gut, no matter what type of source you're getting your amino acids from. But certainly, if we have not nourished our good gut bugs very well, then there's a lot more space for these not so great ones to come in and kind of
mm,
fill the gap. It's kind of like putting ground cover in your garden. You really want to put maybe that I love creeping phlox. And if you put that nice creeping phlox in and cover the ground with that, then there's not as much room for the weeds to grow up. And so that's what I like to think of when I think about the gut microbiome is laying that nice carpet down. Just kind of creating this environment where maybe there's going to be a few weeds here and there, but it's not going to take over. So that's kind of what
I,
we're thinking.
okay, that makes sense. And so what I'm hearing is that as we really feed the fiber loving bugs, they will help to balance all the other categories to where they're not going to create problems for us. Is that
Mhm.
correct? And
Yep,
I just out
yep.
of curiosity, are the bugs that do more of the putrefaction with protein, do they prefer, would you say, plant proteins like beans, or would they prefer like more of maybe of an animal based protein like meats and things like that?
Yeah, so they definitely will use both. If the inflammatory effects in general tend to be greater with animal protein foods.
Hmm.
Um, Now, it's not going to be the exact same outcome for every form of animal protein, certainly. But in general, there's going to be a little bit more inflammatory response from most forms of animal protein. Um, the positive thing I think that would be kind of relevant to mention here is just the composition in general of these foods, not just the amino acids themselves, but the total food, right? Because we don't eat amino acids, we eat
Right.
whole foods. And so if we're eating a plant protein, it's coming in a package with fiber and a whole lot of
Hmm.
other antioxidants and phytochemicals. If we're eating a meat-based protein, yes, it is very bioavailable. That gets talked about a lot. It has all the amino acids. That gets talked about a lot. But it typically comes in a package with a lot of fat. And many of the times that's going to be saturated fat, with the exception, of course, of fish, which is primarily going to be polyunsaturated omega-3s. So if we're consuming a lot of meat that is very high, especially in the saturated fat, we know the impact that saturated fat has on the gut, and it is not good.
Yeah.
High intakes of saturated fat are quite inflammatory in the body, but especially in the gut, and can actually be linked to a little bit more of that permeability or that barrier dysfunction that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's really interesting because what I'm hearing here is that one of the things that happens when you have a very high meat diet is that you are missing, excuse me, you're missing the fiber and the phytochemicals that are really only available from plant foods
Yeah,
because no meat's going to have fiber or phytochemicals.
right.
So if what happens is if we're largely eating of meat proteins, it's pushing those healthy ones off of our plate. Like we can only eat so much in a meal, right? So as we really intentionally eat more of the really fiber rich, phytochemical rich foods, it will decrease the amount of the any other kind of protein like animal products and things. It'll decrease the space on our plate for it, which is basically what will happen there. And that'll help us to maintain a healthy balance in our gut microbiome. And we also talked a little bit about how these animal products tend to be more inflammatory than plant products. So, what role does inflammation have in our mental health? Let's take about 5 minutes here to dig into that inflammation mental health role, because that is really part of what's going on in this whole picture.
hmm Yeah, so a couple of things. Some of it I kind of alluded to
Hmm.
before is that change that happens in the blood-brain barrier. So if we're having more kind of inflammatory chemicals coming into the brain that aren't necessarily supposed to be there, that is certainly something that has been linked to depression. We also
Hmm.
know that the gut microbiome is involved in changing certain amino acids into serotonin, as well as into an inflammatory compound called kynurenine. If you want to take a little
Hmm.
test later and write that one down, and I don't know, take a test, you'll pass. But the kynurenine pathway that takes this tryptophan, this
Hmm.
amino acid that we need, and turns it into this neuroinflammatory compound. This is actually something that the gut microbiome has a big impact on as well. So it tells the body how much serotonin to produce from tryptophan and how much of this inflammatory compound. We can handle small amounts of this compound. It's okay. But once we start to put all of the tryptophan that we're eating into making this inflammatory compound and not so much of it into making serotonin and even melatonin,
Mm,
um, then we start to see some pretty big mood impacts from that. And so, yeah, that's another big kind of relationship as well.
mm,
Um, and then lastly, the impact of blood sugar directly on mood, I think is important to mention
mm,
too. So even though this is it's not something that I think has been studied as well as maybe it should be. This is something that makes sense to, I think, most people who've dealt with both highs and lows on an intuitive level. You know the difference that you feel in your mood and your fatigue levels, your energy levels, your like anxiety and stress and irritability. Like you feel those changes that happen when you go low, and sometimes you also feel it when you go high as well. And I've met people, and you probably have too, who like really know when they're high and people who like have no idea. But those who do, I think a lot of times they feel both maybe jittery and stuff, but also they feel that impact on like anger and irritability, and sometimes a little bit of like euphoria as well, for some people. But
mhm.
it definitely does have an impact on how we're feeling in the moment. So I think that's just important to note as well, because if we're all over the place, like going up and really high and then going down really low and just roller coastering with our blood sugars all throughout the day, our mood stability is going to be all over the place as well. So,
And mood stability is such an important factor to healthy relationships, to how we navigate our daily life. And if we are really struggling with emotional regulation, it makes a lot of things harder. And so, what I'm hearing you say here is that emotional regulation is directly impacted by our choices around what we eat, about what's going on in our gut. So, it's important for us to pay attention to these things, learn more about how we are dealing with these things individually, and where are we? Like, what are the things we can do to improve our gut function that helps improve our mood by decreasing inflammation, all of those things. And I want you to talk just a minute about the free gift that you have for our listeners today. So when they click on the link that's in the description below this video, what are they going to get? And tell me a little bit about the benefits of that.
yeah, so I have for you kind of a tracker, a habit tracker, because I think we all know there are so many things that are going to be good for our health, but it's just a question of like, do we actually do them on a daily basis? And so this comes from a course that I teach on managing depression. Um, but it is very, very applicable to managing inflammation and very applicable to managing diabetes as well. And so, yeah, if you download that habit tracker and just post it up on your fridge and try to track throughout the week, how many days are you getting 20 to 30 minutes of movement? How many days are you feeding your good gut bugs with, at least two or three fruits and at least four or five vegetables, for
Mhm.
example. So hopefully just a really actionable take home, printable resource for you to use.
I love that. And I really appreciate you sharing that with our audience today because as we become more intentional about our choices, we actually start making different changes, different choices based on what we're learning. That's how we're really going to make a difference in our health. Like you can sit here and listen to all kinds of wonderful interviews with me with experts from all different areas. But if you're not actually making some changes to apply the principles that you're learning, you're not going to experience the changes that you could experience in your life. And I want to encourage you to take action today. Download that free handout. Put the tracker up on your fridge, as she said. Start paying attention to what you're doing because just being more aware of what you are or aren't doing is the first step in making positive changes. So I just want to say thank you so much, Erica, for being here. And I want to give you a chance to kind of wrap this up. What is the big takeaway that you would want people to have from our conversation today? What is one thing that if they take this home, this could really make a difference for them?
I just really want to encourage because I know when you're dealing with depression, it can feel so deep, so dark, so hard.
Mm,
And I don't want to oversimplify and make it seem like, this is something that you're failing at and that's why you
mhm,
have depression. That's not my message, but instead my message would be that there are steps that you can take to take back some of that agency, some of that control over your mental health. I want you to feel like diet and lifestyle and just like the things that you're doing, the actions that you can take truly can make a difference in your mental health and in, your inflammation and your diabetes. You can do something to impact that that's not just taking another medication. I think that's really empowering. So yeah, that's just encouragement. You
okay.
can do it.
I love that. Thank you so much, Erica. Really appreciate what you've shared with us today. And for all of you listening, remember that health is wealth and it comes by choice, not by chance. So thank you for being with us here today.